There's an inconvenient truth that most people realize too late. Money thrives not on flash, but on repetition. Not on a brilliant flash, not on a beautiful legend, not on a catchy idea, but on a quiet, stubborn, boring process that does the same thing day after day, while others get distracted, burn out, or give up. That's why the most powerful opportunities often hide not in the noisy and trendy places, but in places where no one wants to stay for long, where others find things too simple, too mundane, too uninteresting. And that's precisely why there's room for those who can think beyond the surface. The problem is that from childhood we're taught to look for impact,
I told
not
you these
sustainability.
projections were wrong.
We're shown stories of high-profile startups, explosive growth, and people who supposedly changed their entire lives with a single brilliant idea. This creates a dangerous illusion that money comes to those who come up with something incredible. But strip away all the romance, and it turns out that the majority of real wealth is built on things no one wants to discuss over dinner, on services that aren't the subject of inspirational videos, on models that lack glamour but have a rhythm, clear demand, and recurring revenue. This is where the main idea of the whole topic begins. A boring business is not a weak business. It's a business that doesn't generate mass enthusiasm and therefore doesn't attract crowds of random competitors. People are much more willing to jump into something that can be showcased beautifully than into something that simply requires regular implementation. And this creates a huge advantage. When a business doesn't seem interesting, it's not dreamers who go there, but operators. And operators ultimately make the money. Because while some seek recognition, others build a flow. Michael E. Gerber described this trap very accurately in his book, The E-Myth Revisited. He demonstrated that one of the biggest mistakes entrepreneurs make is confusing the ability to do the job with the ability to build a system.
Look at the Q3 projections here.
A person can be an excellent specialist, but if everything depends solely on their hands, it's not a business, but an expensive and tedious undertaking. A real business begins when a structure is created that thrives on more than just the owner's energy. This is precisely why boring businesses are so powerful. They're easier to repeat, document, delegate, and transform into a functioning mechanism. And there's another important detail here.
A boring business is almost always undervalued at the start. It's not discussed as a dream. It's not boasted about on social media. It's not something teenagers dream about after watching a motivational video. But that's precisely where the protection lies. When everyone is racing in the same direction, competition increases, expectations become inflated, and entry becomes expensive. But in a boring niche, you can enter quietly, find a place, establish a routine, and start making money not because you were lucky,
from these charts,
but because you stayed longer than everyone else. Sometimes that's a real competitive advantage. And most importantly, a boring business doesn't mean small. It can be local, yet highly profitable. It may seem simple, yet be built on a complex discipline. It may not look prestigious, yet generate more revenue than many beautiful ideas. Because the market doesn't pay for aesthetics, but for pain relief, for convenience, for saving time, for the absence of problems. People pay to avoid thinking about what irritates them. And if you find such a point, you stop looking for inspiration and start looking for repeatable demand.
We have to go now.
And this is where the next thought begins. If repetition is strength, then we need to understand where it hides most strongly and why it is precisely the most inconspicuous patterns that sometimes create the most stable money. The first real strength of a boring business is that most people are too uncomfortable in it to compete. It sounds simple, but it's precisely here that one of the cardinal rules of business lies. When a business seems dirty, physically difficult, monotonous, or socially unprestigious, the crowd disappears. And when the crowd disappears, the profits are no longer divided among hundreds of small, desperate newcomers all seeking the same easy income. What remains is a field where the winners are those who are not afraid to be calm, systematic, and consistent, while others are looking for something more glamorous. That's why models that solve common, annoying, everyday problems can be incredibly powerful. They don't need public adulation. They need local demand. They don't need viral marketing. They need contracts, routes, regularity, and returning customers. Most people ignore such models because they don't seem inspiring enough.
You ruined.
But the market never promised to pay for inspiration. It pays for the relief of inconvenience, for solving a problem that comes back again and again. Cleaning is a good example.
Nobody dreams of owning a cleaning business, and that's precisely why it works. People want clean homes, clean offices, clean facades, and they want it not just once, but constantly. One-time work is just income. A repeat client is the engine. When you have enough of these clients, the business stops feeling like a series of small tasks and starts behaving like a cash flow system. That's the power of a boring model. It doesn't create excitement, but predictability. Michael E. Gerber, in The E-Myth Revisited, explains precisely why this is important. An owner who remains trapped in the daily grind doesn't build an asset. An owner who turns a simple service into a process creates a structure that can survive without their constant involvement. This is the difference between busyness and wealth. Busy people often feel important, but it's the system owners who ultimately earn money without being physically tied to every task. Boring businesses are particularly strong because the process itself is usually easy to understand. And this is more important than it seems. When the model is clear, it's easier to hire, train, monitor, and scale. You don't need complex theory. You need a reliable execution cycle. A client contacts, the task is planned, the service is delivered, the invoice is issued, the client returns. This cycle can work for years if the business consistently solves the same problem. Simplicity in business is not a weakness. Simplicity allows you to repeat an action until it turns into profit. And this is where the magic of recurring revenue comes in. A one-time service is money. A regular service is the base. One cleaning is labor. 10 monthly clients are already a foundation. Once a business reaches this rhythm, the owner can start thinking like an investor, not a firefighter. They no longer chase every new deal from scratch. They manage a system that brings in money on schedule. This is what makes a boring business so attractive to those who want freedom, not applause. Walker Deibel, in Buy Then Build, also draws this line of reasoning. Many of the best businesses aren't the newest ones, but those that already have proven demand, customers, and cash flow. This aligns perfectly with the boring business approach, because in such industries, you often don't need to invent the market. You just need to master it better. A cleaning company becomes valuable not because it invented cleaning, but because it turned cleaning into a stable, understandable, and regularly billable service. The same applies to many other unattractive niches. There's also a psychological advantage. When a business is boring, the owner spends less time feeding the ego and more time focusing on the foundation. They start focusing on retention, routes, response times, process simplicity, upselling, and execution discipline. These aren't glamorous topics, but they are what builds sustainable income. In flashy businesses, too much energy is spent on appearing successful. In boring ones, it's on actually becoming one. The takeaway here is simple. Choose not what looks interesting, but what repeats naturally. Choose a model where demand returns naturally, where the process can be standardized, and where the customer is willing to pay again and again to avoid having to solve the same problem themselves. And then the next question becomes obvious. Which boring businesses have the strongest built-in repeatability? And why do they create the feeling of almost automatic income? There's a category of boring businesses that particularly illustrates this whole idea. Businesses that make money not by creating desire, but by selling access to something people already need. This is where true elegance comes in. Because ownership is expensive, troublesome, and full of hidden problems, while access is simple, convenient, and easily repeatable. When you make money not by convincing people to want something new, but by putting the right solution in the right place, you enter a completely different business logic. That's why machine-based models are so powerful. Vending, ATMs, laundromats, storage, parking, all these industries operate on the same principle. They transform space into revenue. They turn location into leverage. They transform an empty corner, an inconspicuous hallway, an unused plot of land, or a small facility into a source of income that can operate with almost no emotional involvement from the owner. From the outside, it looks too simple. But simplicity doesn't mean weakness. Often, simplicity means scalability, and scalability means serious money. The secret isn't in the machine itself. The secret is that the machine solves a small but unavoidable problem the moment the customer senses it. Someone needs cash. Someone needs a snack. Someone needs laundry. Someone needs a parking space. Someone needs somewhere to store their things. None of these needs seem inspiring, but they're recurring, and recurring needs create recurring revenue. You don't want the customer to be emotionally excited. You want them to be uncomfortable without your solution. The most interesting thing about these models is that they're often undervalued precisely because of their apparent simplicity. People see a machine and think it's almost passive, but the owner sees the routes, placement, load, uptime, maintenance, and location strategy. And this difference in perception is everything. A machine in the wrong location is just hardware. The same machine in the right location is a small business. And here, Walker Dival's idea in Buy Then Build is very true. Real value is in cash flow, not in a beautiful story about how something was built from scratch. Machine-based businesses reflect this best. Another important advantage is that such models rarely require complex explanations. Their value is instantly clear. A person approaches, sees the machine, and understands its purpose. This is a huge advantage. When the model is clear, the owner spends less effort on persuasion and more on fundamentals: location, price, replenishment, maintenance, stability. The more a business operates on routine, the more it begins to feel like an asset rather than a job. And that's when ownership begins to feel easier. Michael E. Gerber would call this the type of business built on a system, not a personality. And this is important because the less a company relies on its owner's charisma, the easier it is to survive without their daily presence. And in a boring business, survival is just the beginning. Once a system survives, it can be improved. Once it's improved, the compounding effect begins. And that's where small streams of income begin to add up to significant revenue. Another important point is that such models often grow in clusters. One facility leads to another. One machine leads to 5. One route becomes a territory. One locational experience accelerates the launch of the next facility. This effect is easy to miss if you look only at individual transactions. A machine that generates a few $100s a month seems like a small change. But when such points accumulate, a stable base emerges. This is the main lesson. Boring businesses rarely win with one big event. They win by accumulation. The bottom line at this level is simple. The quietest models often succeed because they transform invisible demand into visible revenue. They may not look flashy from the outside, but they very effectively monetize a common human need. And once this is understood, the next layer becomes even more interesting, because the same principle explains why some service businesses turn out to be much stronger than they initially appear. A real breakthrough in a boring business begins when you stop thinking like a seller and start thinking like an access owner. This difference seems small, but it changes everything. Because once you understand that people are willing to pay simply for the opportunity to get the right solution at the right time, you stop looking for dramatic products and start looking for pressure points. You begin to see where demand accumulates quietly, where convenience has a price, and where the lack of an option creates profits for the first mover. This is why some ordinary businesses become surprisingly powerful. They don't sell delight, they sell relief. And relief is one of the most reliable currencies in commerce. A customer in a hurry, a customer in discomfort, a customer without an alternative, a customer who needs it right now. These aren't people looking for a beautiful story. They're people looking for the fastest way back to normal. That's why businesses built on repeated inconvenience can be incredibly profitable. They sit right in the middle of frustration and offer an easy way out. This is where the most underrated operators come in. They don't think about how impressive a business looks. They think about how useful it is at a pain point. This is a much more profitable question. A machine in the right place, a service on the right route, a contract with the right client, a location with the right flow. These are all different versions of the same idea. You don't create demand, you capture it. And when you understand this, the entire market becomes much clearer. This clarity is also important because boring businesses thrive not on drama, but on structure. The better the system, the less the owner has to live in constant tension. The more predictable the demand, the easier it is to standardize service delivery. This is why Michael E. Gerber's insight from the E-Myth Revisited remains so powerful. A business becomes real when it operates as a system, not as a reflection of the owner's mood.
If a company relies solely on your presence, it's fragile. If it relies on process, it can scale. When you look at it through this lens, it becomes clear why many small businesses are actually very smart assets. A laundry room isn't just a room with machines. It's a place people return to because the need never goes away. A parking lot isn't just empty space, it's managed convenience in a dense location. Storage isn't just boxes. It's a solution to the problem modern life creates itself, forcing people to store more than they can fit at home. Each of these businesses succeeds not because they're beautiful, but because they exist at the intersection of necessity and repetition. Walker Deibel, in Buy Then Build, reinforces this point. If a business already has repeat demand, the smartest strategy is often not invention, but acquisition and improvement. And this is especially powerful here because many boring businesses already have their main asset, habit. Customers don't buy once, they come back because the need reoccurs. And when a business is built into habit, you're no longer fighting for attention every day. You're leveraging routine. This is one of the most underrated forms of leverage in business. The beauty of this model is that it grows quietly. It doesn't need a huge audience. It doesn't need a massive brand. It doesn't need a viral moment. It needs the right address, the right problem, the right process, and enough consistency to continue generating revenue. That's why many such businesses look boring on the outside and feel almost unfair on the inside. The owner sees what others don't. Every recurring problem is a chance to get paid again. Every regular need is a door back to the customer. Every predictable pain is a chance to build a sustainable money machine. And here's the key takeaway. The best boring businesses aren't built on persuasion. They're built on inevitability. People need them, come back, and pay again because the problem keeps coming back. This kind of revenue is powerful because it doesn't rely on novelty. It relies on human behavior remaining remarkably stable. And it's this stability that takes us to the next level. The moment when a service ceases to be just a service and begins to transform into a system that almost runs itself. At a certain point, a business ceases to be just a service and begins to drive business. That's when a boring business becomes truly dangerous, in a good way, because the owner is no longer simply doing work for money, but building a structure that continues to generate income with ever-decreasing friction. From the outside, people often see only routine. They see repetition, a simple service, a standard operating procedure. But the owner sees accumulation. Every repeated task strengthens the system. Every returning client stabilizes the base. And every small improvement makes the next month easier than the last. That's the hidden beauty of a strong, boring business. It doesn't require constant reinvention to grow. It grows when it becomes more organized, more predictable, and more efficient than it was before. One route becomes 2. One crew becomes 3. One regular customer becomes 10. One repeatable service becomes a reliable machine.
And once such a machine exists, the owner begins to do the most important thing in business: remove themselves from the center of every problem. This isn't laziness. This is architecture. This is where Michael E. Gerber's insight from the E-Myth Revisited hits the nail on the head. A business becomes a true enterprise when it operates on a system, not on the owner's personal adrenaline. If the owner remains a bottleneck, the company can't breathe freely. When processes are established, the team is trained, standards are defined, and quality is maintained without constant manual oversight, the business begins to behave like an asset. And this is the turning point. Small business ceases to mean small future. That's why boring businesses often scale quietly, not through fame, through reliability. Reliability makes hiring easier, increases customer retention, and makes forecasting more accurate. It also reduces the emotional burden on the owner. You stop living in "today is the day." You start reading the system. And the system doesn't understand moods, trends, or ego. It only knows input, output, and consistency. And that's a much better playing field for the long game. Walker Deibel in Buy Then Build gives this another boost. When a business already has proven demand, it's often more profitable to improve rather than create. In a boring business, improvement is everything. You improve dispatching. You improve payment collection. You improve follow-up. You improve communication. You improve training. You improve margins by making the same service cleaner and faster.
And because the service is repeated, the effect of these improvements accumulates. It is in this accumulation that wealth is created. A psychological advantage is no less important than a financial one. When a business becomes predictable, the owner gains the ability to think long-term. They stop treating each day as a threat. They can plan, invest, and expand without feeling constantly in chaos. And this improves the quality of their decisions. Discipline in pricing, hiring, and growth improves. And it is precisely this discipline that distinguishes a business that simply churns through from one that truly builds capital. That's why many such companies are stronger than they appear. They're built not on a single brilliant event, but on consistent human behavior. People continue to need the same things. Buildings continue to require maintenance. Customers continue to return. Problems continue to recur. And if a business is structured to effectively capture these recurring needs, the result isn't flashy, but it's powerful. It pays. It accumulates. It stabilizes the owner's life more than most flashy models. And there's a final important takeaway. The best boring businesses become almost invisible because they work too well. They stop demanding constant attention, and that's precisely what makes them valuable. A business that doesn't require drama, heroism, or constant reinvention isn't boring in the bad sense. It's boring in the most profitable sense of the word. And then the final step remains, to show how all this turns into not just stability, but an almost automatic flow of money when the owner no longer carries everything on his own, but receives results from his own system. At some point, the owner realizes that the most valuable thing in a business is no longer the service itself. What matters most is repetition, system, and the calm predictability of income. That's when it becomes clear a boring business can be not just stable, but almost automatic, if it's built correctly. This is the final form of this story. Not flashy, not showy, but very powerful. Because when the system works, money begins to appear not through daily stress, but through accumulated order. At this point, the business stops asking the owner for constant heroism. It begins to demand architecture. And this is a fundamentally different level.
When processes are documented, when the team understands what to do, when repetitive tasks are standardized, the owner ceases to be the center of every action. They become a system manager, not a person manually saving the day. This is true freedom in a boring business, not the absence of work, but the absence of chaos. Michael E. Gerber in The E-Myth Revisited talks about exactly this. A business should function as a system, not as a reflection of the owner's personality. If the owner is the sole driver, scale quickly becomes limited by their strength. If a business is built on processes, it can operate without constant emotional input. This is especially important for boring models because it is in them that repetition becomes a source of strength. The less improvisation, the greater the resilience. The greater the resilience, the easier it is to build long-term cash flow. At the same time, the very logic of growth in a boring business is very mature. Miracles aren't expected here. Here, small improvements add up to big results. A slightly better route, a slightly faster application processing, a slightly more accurate schedule, a slightly more disciplined payment collection, a slightly more attentive retention, a slightly better staff training. Each of these steps seems small on its own, but together they create a business that runs smoother, cleaner, and more profitable. That's how autopilot is created, not by magic, but by discipline. Walker Deibel adds an important insight to this in Buy, Then Build. If a business is already making money, the best path is often not to start anew, but to buy and improve. This is especially true for boring industries because their main asset is the existing pipeline. You don't need to reconvince the market, you need to optimize what's already been bought from reality. And this is precisely what makes boring businesses so interesting for those who value results, not noise. There's another psychological layer that's often overlooked. When a business is predictable, the owner begins to think strategically rather than reactively. They stop fearing every slow day because they see the system as a whole. They can plan months in advance. They can think about hiring, expansion, new locations, and selling the business as an asset. And this is no longer simply working for yourself. It's building an infrastructure that over time begins to work for them. So the main idea behind this whole topic is very simple. Boring businesses don't win because they're impressive. They win because they repeat themselves. And if repetition is built into the model itself, over time it becomes sustainability, and sustainability becomes freedom. This is why the quietest businesses often last longer, fail less often, and ultimately generate more revenue than the flashiest projects that fizzle out at the start. The takeaway from this chapter, and the entire story, is this. Don't look for the business that screams the loudest. Look for one that can be built into a system, repeated without unnecessary drama, and improved year after year. Because it's often where everything seems too simple, too ordinary, and too boring that true wealth begins.